Right, welcome everybody. So this is our 5 years on from the referendum meeting, and we've all been sitting here just before the meeting starts thinking, goodness me, how could it possibly be 5 years? It doesn't seem like it's that long. Anyway, here we are, it's 5 years on. So I'm delighted to be joined by Laura Parker, ex of Momentum, now of Labour for a New Democracy, and a whole bunch of other exciting ventures. And Christabel Cooper, who is a Labour councillor in West London and is our resident kind of data guru who knows things about numbers and what people actually think rather than what we would just like them to think. Laura, if we can start off with you, that would be great. So we'll do as we normally do. We'll have presentations from each of the speakers. Seb Dance is joining in a minute, former MEP, and then we'll have time for a conversation and Q&A afterwards. So Laura, over to you.
Right, well, I'm really relieved that Christabel is here because this means I don't even have to pretend to remember any numbers. So I thought I would start off with some probably not very original reflections about how we got where we are, and a couple of thoughts about where we in Labour might want to try to take ourselves next. And I'm not in the expectation I'm going to say anything at all original, but just to maybe give us food for thought for a bit of a chat, because I guess many of you, like me, will feel the need for a cathartic session. Oh, there is Seb Dance, my former campaign partner. Unlike me, he actually got elected, however. So how did we get here? I guess there's what Jonathan Friedland at The Guardian would call the long view. And I think the long view is relevant to where we go next. So I am just going to spend a couple of seconds on it. I mean, historically, obviously, the UK's had an ambivalent relationship with the European Union. I have always felt, I worked for 15 years in child protection, and any of you who've got children will know about how kids form attachment, and kids in sort of stable relationships where they feel they're at home, you know, they form strong attachments and they weather them through all sorts of ups and downs and the trials and tribulations of family life, but more or less in the end, you sort of stay together. Children who you know grow up in care or grow up without family or move through various foster care placements, who don't feel that family is actually theirs, you know, can have real difficulty forming attachment. And my basic amateur psychology is that the UK never really formed a strong attachment bond with the EU. We never really felt like it was ours. We got there a bit too late for a start. By the time we got there, the model of the EU institutional setup, well, not the EU at the time, of course, was very much based on one that wasn't quite familiar to us. And any of you who, like me, have worked in the European Commission will know that there are features of the way that the EU functions institutionally which don't feel much like the UK. I was also a UK civil servant. So we had this ambivalent relationship. We scapegoated it for years, or we let other people scapegoat it for years. We didn't want to say, actually, we voted for that in the Council of Ministers, not helped, of course, by the fact that the Council of Ministers also voted in secrecy. So the democratic deficit of the European Union allowed us, like other member states, to enabling this scapegoating. We underestimated during our 40 years of this rather ambivalent relationship the point at which public permission for us to continue was dwindling. And I think we, the generally sort of internationalist, liberal, left, centre left, because we were basically bought into this project, not enough of us probably questioned frequently enough what was being done in the name of Europe. And if we were broadly happy with it, we sort of went along with it. But we probably should have checked in earlier, in my view, actually. I unusually, for a Labour member, I did want a referendum. I didn't want the one that we had, and I didn't want it when we had it. And I certainly would have constructed it differently, like any decent European other member state who knows how to do a referendum with a double majority, with rules about what would happen with the 4 nations, with rules about how you could campaign without lying in the press and possibly without some Russian money thrown in. But I did believe in the principle of a referendum, and I think if we'd had one some time ago, we might have had a different result. But we underestimated all of this because we weren't sort of paying enough attention. And carried away by our own, I believe, bust electoral system, we also misunderstood the strength of support that we had and our so-called Labour safe seats. Well, they could be very safe in an electoral system which gives you a seat with 30, 35, 40, 45, even 50%. But it's a whole different game when you have a referendum. So we had all these sort of background things going on historically. And then we get to the campaign, and Labour didn't campaign as well as it can. And we know that because we saw Labour campaigning as well as it could in 2017. And I, who supported Corbyn and still support most of the political project of Corbyn, you know, if I'm honest, that was a lackluster effort from Jeremy. But it wasn't a lackluster effort just from Jeremy. The party was riven and divided. Party HQ and the leader's office weren't seeing eye to eye. And then there was our relationship with the rest of the campaign, which was obviously incredibly complicated. Jeremy didn't want to share platforms with David Cameron. I don't suppose David Cameron wanted to share platforms with Jeremy either. Alan Johnson was off there sort of doing his thing or not doing it. We didn't run the kind of campaign that we should have done, but we'd obviously lost it some time before. Campaigning on Project Fear, of course, is now possibly in part going to come and bite us, because maybe some aspects of Project Fear aren't going to come true. And of course, then the pandemic has masked some of what is also happening with the economy. But at the time, of course, the project was that Project Fear wasn't inspiring. Like the 2017 election got people up out of their armchairs because it was full of hope and vision. And it was inspiring, positive story about the changes that we want. And that is not the campaign that was run in 2017. So for all sorts of reasons, we let ourselves down. Much of that you'll agree with, and much of it you may disagree with. What can we learn from it now? Well, the first thing is that we must not be ambivalent about defending what we actually believe in. Now, that isn't to say that I think that we should be running a rejoin campaign tomorrow. I am zooming in from Italy. I'm married to an Italian, and Mike Buckley's heard this a million times. My niece is Spanish, and I met my husband in Bulgaria, and leaving the EU for me, as for many of you, is an actual impossibility. Notwithstanding that, I don't think we should be campaigning now for rejoin. But what we should not be doing is repeating the mistake of being ambivalent about what we believe in. And the Labour Party's job now is to hold the Tories to account on all of those promises that they made. Now, I believe we made a strategic or political management error in voting for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I personally think we should have abstained. That was a little bit difficult at the time because we had abstained under quite a few things in the run up to it. But that is a political management error, because the one thing that we knew was going to happen last year was that at some point we'd have to vote on a deal. So if you believe, as obviously some people around the leadership do, that you can only abstain so many times, well, for heaven's sake, keep one of them behind so you can use it for the Brexit deal, or indeed vote against. We're going to see a million clips at the next election when we try to complain about the deal, reminding us that we voted for it. So I personally think that was a tactical and strategic error. Nevertheless, we can still now defend what we believe in. And we should be defending migrants and migrants' rights and the rights of EU citizens in the next 2 weeks in particular, which are going to prove to be very difficult for some. We should refine the energy that we found talking about workers' rights in the 2017 campaign, and indeed, which we have found more generally, I think, since Brexit. We should be talking very explicitly as we get nearer to the point about the revision of the agreement. There is an opportunity for us to ameliorate the worst effects of Brexit. And I do not understand why that's an opportunity that the Labour Party won't take. We should not be looking in the rearview mirror all the time. So one of the things for me that was a mistake about the way that we voted for the deal was it the end of last year or the start of this year, was it felt as if we were sort of engaging in some Brexit virility test. We had to vote for it to prove that we'd understood that Leave had won. But this wasn't about Leave or Remain. It was about how we leave. And somehow we have got to find a way of rescuing the narrative. We've accepted that we are leaving the building. The point is, were we throwing ourselves off the roof or taking the lift or the stairs? Now, we may have missed the moment to make that point, but there is still plenty of road ahead when we should be reminding the Tories of all the promises that they made, the 99% false promises, I'm sure, and we should be standing up for Labour values of internationalism, including migrants' rights, of workers' rights, of environmental standards, obviously we've got the COP coming at the end of this year, and this all ties together. And we should be trying to repair our relationships with our European friends and allies. And I'm sure Seb will have things to say on this. We cannot now disappear. One of the great ironies for me of Jeremy's leadership was that actually he made a much bigger effort with the Party of European Socialists than his predecessors had, and he went to far more meetings. And in the first half of his leadership, he was welcomed like a bit of a sort of conquering hero. That obviously faded slightly. But we need to rebuild those relationships. And that's basically the two things that I think we should now be about: holding to account through things like the briefing that Labour for European Future is doing and sending to MPs. Another Europe is Possible is doing a Brexit spotlight. Obviously, the Labour Movement for Europe is going to continue with its work, Best for Britain. And we should be rebuilding those relationships so that when we are eventually in a position to think about formalising our relationship with the institutional setup of the EU, we are in a better position to do it, because the Leave campaign spent the best part of sort of 20 years getting us out, and we may have to spend the best part of 10 getting us in. But we will only do that if, once we finally have the chance for that discussion, we have rebuilt trust and faith, and people actually, quite frankly, want to have the conversation with us. Because when I look at the press in Italy, it's not jumping up and down with sorrow that we've gone. And you know, the Italians quite like the Brits as a general rule. They don't talk about us anymore. They stopped talking about us quite a long time ago. So we have to put some real effort now into rebuilding those relationships. And that, I think, is the job of us, these still pro-Europeans who are still in the Labour Party. Okay, that was enough from me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laura. That was wonderful. Seb, we'll come straight across to you, please.
Yep. Thank you, Mike, and thanks, Laura. It's great to see you again. We come from different ends, perhaps, of the political spectrum in the party, and it appears different ends of the same bookshelf as well. But but you know, nonetheless, we seem to end up agreeing on pretty much everything. I mean, it won't surprise you to know that I agree with the analysis that Laura's given about the rather lackluster efforts by some in the party during the referendum. Not by no means everyone. I mean, as we know, we campaigned extremely hard, but I think it's fair to say that, you know, this is a defeat that was long in the making, and it didn't happen 5 years ago. It happened 15 or even longer years ago. And you know, when you're up against the combined efforts of the tabloid press, this constant undermining of European values and what the European Union stood for. It was astonishing, frankly, that Remain got 48%. And you know, I think it tells you that we could have won it, but we needed to put the groundwork in a lot sooner. Having said all of that, I mean, losing the referendum was one thing, and I was reflecting on I reflect on this all the time. In fact, I think about it every wretched day. But the reality is it wasn't so much losing the referendum that was difficult, but actually the aftermath and the way in which I think you know, the principles of European solidarity and being part of something bigger were kind of jettisoned because they were suddenly rather awkward bits of baggage. I mean, you know, we need to remember that after all is said and done, whatever the opinion polls, whatever the state of affairs in British politics, it remains the case that our sister parties and trade union movements across Europe all support the European Union, the principle of European solidarity, working together for a solution of common aims, and you know, are all fighting to make the EU a better place. Because, you know, as Laura says, the EU is by no means perfect and is full of the same conflicting politics and challenges that we face at a national level. And we have to, you know, continually obviously fight for what it is that we believe in. And the trade union and labour movement has been doing that at the European level for decades. And quite frankly, they need all the support and help they can get, and that's why we shouldn't forget, you know, that it is our mission, if you like, to continue to provide that voice from the UK Labour Party as strongly and as vociferously as possible. Obviously, and again, I would agree with Laura on the immediate mission, which is not to campaign to rejoin. But nonetheless, I do think it's important to say that some of us believe that is in our best interests at some point. and at some point can be, a matter for debate, obviously, but we obviously need to prepare the groundwork and start the campaign to rejoin, which ironically is not a campaign to rejoin, but a campaign to reintegrate and to reconnect some of the connections that have been ripped apart by this government. Now, that can take a number of forms. Obviously, we're still members of PES. Laura very kindly mentioned the Labour Movement for Europe, which I'm honoured to have just taken over the chair of. That is, of course, Labour for a European Future, together with many sister organisations and affiliated societies. We should all be making the case for a stronger and closer relationship, and in effect trying to replicate some of the links, the formal links that we've lost through leaving the European Union. And I think there is an appetite. It is absolutely right that the majority kind of conversation in the media in the 27 member states, as most, well, 26 member states, because in Ireland it's a different matter, has definitely moved on. But when it comes to the day-to-day practicalities, cities and regions working together to solve common problems like climate change, to solve problems like housing and congestion and inequality, these are the kinds of issues that we can join forces with our cousins across the continent and indeed beyond the continent. Let's not just restrict this to Europe. There are ways in which we can be internationalists and rebuild those links. But what absolutely 100% has to happen, and again I agree with Laura here, is that we have to, as a party, make it very clear that the negative effects of Brexit are a result of the government's deal. It's a direct result of the political decisions that this government has made. Now, we don't even need, frankly, to mention the B word. We don't even need to refer back to a decision that was taken 5 years ago. But we do need to refer to the decisions that the government is making. It's not an inevitability that we are cut off from Erasmus, for example. It's not an inevitability that the next generation has fewer opportunities than their brothers and sisters across the continent who have the right to free movement, who can build the networks and are better positioned for the jobs of the future, which are inevitably going to rely on networks, by the way, when we see an increase in automation in a whole range of sectors, not just traditional manufacturing, but in services as well. The robots are coming, and it's going to be analytical power and the ability to network and that kind of ability that will empower our young people. And I'm afraid we've just made it very, very much harder for Brits in that environment. Of course, it's easier for Brits than it is for many other people in the world. But the point is, we shouldn't be having some kind of race to the bottom. We should be trying to raise opportunities and standards across the board. And our government have just denied young people a whole array of opportunities. And we have to be making that link. Look at what's happened to the fishing industry, for example. Look at what's happened to our food and drink exports. And incidentally, these are going to affect people in seats that we might not traditionally associate with our party. But actually, there is a huge cohort of people who are going to find their day-to-day lives becoming just that little bit harder. And in the context of recovering from what has been a terrible, terrible time for most people, I mean, we're all fed up with this, right? But we've all kind of, by and large, stuck together and are getting through a very difficult time. When it comes to a final reopening and we're double jabbed and freedoms start to reappear, it's going to feel very, very different for some people when they find that the things that they have perhaps got used to doing in the context of doing business in Europe, or perhaps exporting their services, perhaps they've exported a particular consultancy advice in fields like architectural design, in insurance, a whole range of different sectors that we don't immediately think of. It's going to be very, very much harder for them now to do the jobs they were doing across a market that they were just seamlessly part of before. And this stuff isn't being discussed because, frankly, people aren't traveling at the moment, and most of the things that we're doing are focused on our immediate environment. But at some point, this will start to be an issue. And I think bit by bit, the effects of Brexit will become more and more obvious. And as the pandemic recedes, as we all hope it will, it will at some point, then as the effects of the pandemic recede, the impacts of Brexit are going to become very much obvious. And here's the real rub for the Labour Party. If we don't start linking the government's decisions, political decisions, and the effect of those political decisions, then when it comes to finding an explanation for why bad things are happening, either to people's jobs or in people's career chances or networks and so on, what is the explanation going to be? What is the credible narrative going to be? And at the moment, if we're not providing a counter narrative, it's very easy to see who will try and pick up that narrative. And it's, of course, the far right. They will then end up scapegoating the most vulnerable in our society. They will, the target will stop being the EU, and it will start being other groups of people within our society who, frankly, don't have the resources to be able to defend themselves against the kind of onslaught that could be unleashed. Now, that is the logical extension of where we get to if it's not possible to link what the government is doing to the effects that it's producing. And that is really at the heart of this. And it's why I think the Labour Party really is missing two things. Firstly, it's historic duty to prevent that kind of situation from happening. And secondly, a real electoral opportunity here to try and grab some votes from people who frankly would not have voted Labour in the past. I haven't given up hope at all. I think, we will get there. I just think, it's up to us to make the case, and it's up to us to not stop making the case, because it can be tempting sometimes to sort of throw your hands up and think, oh, you know what, this is all too difficult. And it is difficult, but look at us. There's loads of us here on the one sunny evening that we've had in recent days, and we're still giving up our time to talk about this and to organize and to be effective. Let's continue that, because we're going to need it, and we're going to need to be united. And I think Laura and I, if we can agree on so many things, including, by the way, PR, then I think, that puts the party in good stead for the future. And I have an awful lot of hope that we will right this wrong, but it's going to take time and it's going to take organisation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Seb. And I share your optimism and also your awareness that there's a job to be done. Christabel, I'll come to you, please.
Thank you very much. And in a not shock kind of events, you'll find that I agree with very much a lot of what both Laura and Seb have just said. And ultimately the conclusion that I think that this is an opportunity for Labour politically, but that's to put the conclusion before the beginning. So I'll go back to the beginning instead now. So 5 years. Looking back over the last 5 years, I think for all of us, it has been an absolute roller coaster of emotions, from despair through to hope, through to intense anxiety, and then back to despair again. And I suppose the only good thing about being where we are is that, I don't miss that roller coaster. And it has, I think, given us a chance to look back on that with slightly, perhaps a bit more dispassion than we were when we were in the midst of it. And one of the things that I think I have been thinking about is, obviously there's been a lot of emotion on the Remain side, but equally there was a lot of emotion on the Leave side. And I think that it's probably a good idea to try and think about that and think about, try to understand that a bit more, because I do think that is at the essence of how we turn this around. The last person I spoke to on the day of the general election in 2019, last person whose door I knocked on was somebody who probably shouldn't have been on the Labour get out the vote list. We hadn't spoken to him for some time. And the first thing that he said to me was, I'm not voting for Andy. Andy wants to overturn our vote. Andy being our local MP, Andy Slaughter. And so, of course, I said to him, well, look, when we're not trying to overturn your vote, a second referendum is a sensible solution to the fact that, we don't seem to be able to get a deal through Parliament. The idea that having another democratic vote is somehow undemocratic doesn't seem to make any sense. You're still at liberty to vote Leave. Everyone who voted Leave is still at liberty to make the same decision if they still want to. I said what would be more anti-democratic is, if the UK takes this extremely important long-term decision that's going to affect generations of people in this country, and actually perhaps people have changed their mind, it would be very undemocratic to impose that on a population which actually didn't want it. Unsurprisingly, he didn't agree with me and rounded off the conversation by telling me that I spoke very good English. So anyway, so that was a great end to a fairly awful day. But going back and thinking about that, I think, you know, what perhaps we didn't really understand about how Leavers saw the second referendum was quite how emotional they felt about it. The nearest analogy I can come up with is the idea that, you know, if you supported a lower league football team and somehow you end up beating Man City in the FA Cup final, and then suddenly Man City turn around with a bunch of expensive lawyers and say, well, no, there's been a technicality that we've got wrong, and we need to play the game again, with, of course, the expectation that, you know, second time around, Man City will destroy you. And the most glorious moment in your club's history is going to be snatched from you completely unfairly. Now, of course, you know, you can pick any number of holes in that analogy, but I do think it represents what quite a lot of Leavers felt. And that's what we were fighting against, particularly in the general election of 2019. But I think now that we have left, now that we have this admittedly awful deal, I think a lot of the emotion from the Leave side has gone out of this debate. There was some polling recently from Ipsos Mori, talking mainly about the culture wars, but it had a section on Leavers and Remainers. And it actually found that Leavers have less negativity towards Remainers than Remainers have towards Leavers. So Leavers are more likely to say that they would be willing to be friends with a Remainer, whereas Remainers are less likely to say they would be friends with a Leaver. Interestingly, it's also said that more people now identify, quite a lot more people, the figures, I think it was something like 53% versus 39%, more people identify as Remainers than Leavers. So it suggests that quite a few Leavers, I mean, at one point it was, you know, pretty much everybody had a view on it. So I think it's really interesting that Leavers seem to have abandoned, some Leavers at least, seem to have abandoned that identity. There's also some Ipsos Mori polling which came out today, which identified 7 Brexit tribes, of which only 2, comprising 25% of the total population, really care all that much about Brexit. Sorry, this is 2 Leave tribes care all that much about Brexit. So, you know, there's what they found is that there's a growth of people in the middle of the Brexit debate who don't particularly identify anymore with either side. So the people who strongly identify with the Brexit, either Leave or Remain side, has gone down from 55% in 2019 to 35% now. What, however, is interesting is there's been little shift in the overall views. People, you know, it's still very evenly split about whether people think it was right to leave or remain. And if you ask people whether they would rejoin, in fact, you get a slight majority for people saying that they don't want to. So I would very much agree with what the previous 2 speakers said, that okay, pushing the case for rejoin right now, I think would be a mistake. But it's interesting that, you know, more than 2 in 5 people think that there are still many important issues to finalise and lots more negotiations to come in Brexit. This is now what UK and Thinks polling. They found that Leavers are split on whether they think immigration will go down as a result of Brexit, but 51% of Leavers do expect the economy will get better, and only 1 in 5 think that it will get worse as a result of Brexit. Now, the fact is that the economic effects of Brexit so far have been largely hidden by COVID, and Seb is absolutely right. They are going to start coming through at some point. You can already see the differential in the loss of trade with the EU and with the rest of the world. But, you know, clearly the pandemic has been the most important thing that's happened to the economy, and it has been hidden for now. But I think we are going to start seeing the results, the economic damage that he talked about. And there's a European movement project that's underway to actually properly track and record that damage in a database. So we'll be able to see it. And it's interesting that even now, before that damage has properly appeared or properly been visible, Leavers are fairly split about whether the government has handled the negotiations well or badly. 35% of Leavers think the government has handled it badly, whereas only 42% think they've handled it well. So what all this is saying to me is that quite a lot of voters think that Brexit is not done. Quite a lot of Leavers think that the government already has handled the negotiations badly, but also that they have quite high expectations of what's going to happen to the economy, that they think that, you know, it's going to be a good thing for the economy. So the conclusion that I would draw from that is that Labour putting forward the case for renegotiating this awful deal isn't actually going to be as politically controversial as I think some people really think it is. However, against that, of course, we've got some of the most recent election results. The local elections, Labour did badly in places that voted heavily for Leave, did slightly better in places that voted to Remain. Seems to suggest that actually people still are very much in that Brexit mindset, and that Labour is still being punished by Leave voters. But I don't think that necessarily means that Brexit itself is the same kind of issue that it was in 2019. If you look what's happening under the bonnet, it's mostly Brexit Party supporters moving to the Tories. And I would say that, you know, these clearly are the voters that care very deeply about Brexit itself, but they're a relatively small minority. What the bigger problem that we have, but also the bigger opportunity, was the people that switched directly from Labour to the Tories. And these tended to be people that were more towards the soft end of the Brexit spectrum. They didn't particularly want no deal, most of them. And I think a lot of the reason that they did choose to vote for the Tories, some of it at least, was to do with the leadership of the Labour Party at the time. The problem that we have is they're sticking with the Tories. And a lot of that is just to do, I think, with the stickiness of incumbency and the fact that Labour just has not given them any reason to change their minds at the moment. And that's a whole different other can of fish about, sorry, not can of fish, can of worms about, you know, why it is that Labour is not speaking to them, or Labour doesn't seem to have a coherent message. But I do think that that's why largely they're still sticking with the Tories. Then, of course, we have Chesham and Amersham. And this does look, I mean, there's almost certainly lots of reasons why there was such a huge swing against the Tories, but it does seem likely that Brexit was one of them, and that the Tory Remain vote, which was kind of the dog that didn't bark in the 2019 election, finally found its voice. And again, I think that some of that has got to do with the fact that a lot of them, they had a very negative view of Jeremy Corbyn, and I think a lot of them stuck with the Tories out of fear of a Corbyn-led government. And very possibly, actually, a lot of them, they tended to be fairly soft Remainers, and they didn't like the idea of having a second referendum. But now that's off the table. These are people who, you know, can clearly see that the Brexit deal that the Tories have constructed is simply not a good one. And I can't believe that that's not part of their vote in Chesham. And of course, you know, now we're seeing with the reality of what trade deals outside the EU look like. And we've got the Australia deal, which will apparently gain consumers in Britain a grand total of 70p a year. But at the same time, in return for that 70p a year, we're doing, you know, a whole load of damage to farming smallholders. And I think now we've got the opportunity to understand a bit better from the bottom up what trade deals really mean. And what they do mean is that you get a certain amount of economic benefit, and you have to put up with, you know, a certain amount of rules that you might not like. And those trade deals outside the EU are going to be ones which gain us less than we had in the EU, and probably will impose things on us that are things that we really dislike. Whereas at the moment, actually, the regulation that we have from the EU is reasonably popular. You know, I'm sorry, I always bang on about this particular piece of polling, but I think it's really interesting. There's a deliberative polling exercise carried out in November 2020, where they took a bunch of Leave and Remain voters and polled them before and after the event about whether the UK should continue to follow EU regulations on various things like roaming, flight compensation and food labelling. And having discussed this and having sort of gone through some of the arguments for and against, what you actually found, there was a bunch of Leavers after the event had changed their minds, and a majority of them wanted to stick with EU regulations. So it does seem to indicate that actually, if you talk about these things, if you actually talk about why we have these regulations, what the benefits are, even Leave voters will support them. And in fact, a majority of Leavers anyway want a very close or fairly close relationship with the EU. Only 8% of them want a distant or fairly distant relationship. So all of this does seem to be indicating that it's not that politically difficult to argue for a closer relationship. And, you know, the problem is that the problem at the very heart of Brexit has been that we're only talking about what kind of Brexit we are going to get after 5 years after we've actually had a vote to leave, which is a fairly disgraceful and quite deliberate state of affairs engineered by the Leave vote. However, they're now going to have to face up to the fact that actually that Leave coalition was very split. Its leaders were people who were ultra Thatcherites. They wanted a bonfire of regulation. Patrick Minford, the only economist to see any benefit from Brexit, was somebody who advocated the destruction of the manufacturing and agriculture industry in this country. And yet when you look at those red wall voters, I don't know if any of you read the Deborah Mattison book, a lot of those people thought that actually leaving the EU would bring manufacturing industry back rather than destroy it. So this is a fairly split coalition of people who have very, very different expectations from Brexit. And that's the split that's also at the heart of the current Tory vote. So actually, I think there's a really big opportunity here for Labour to show a bunch of people who are often quite economically left-leaning who voted for Brexit that the Tory Brexit deal that has been negotiated is not in their interests. I do think, you know, at the moment we just seem to be in this absolute terror of this kind of angry leaver, but all the evidence that seems to be gathered at the moment is that emotion, a lot of that emotion has gone out of the Leave vote, and now they're expecting real things, which Brexit just isn't going to deliver in its current format. So broadly, I think if we can move on from this being a battle about identity, about overturning your vote, about this kind of this narrative that pervaded the last 5 years, that there's this tiny liberal elite that's trying to deny the will of the people. I mean, it's obviously nonsense, but I think that is how people felt. But I think they're moving away from that. And if we can move on from that to an actually making Brexit into a policy discussion about, is this policy that the Tories have of a very hard Brexit good for people's jobs? Is it good for people's livelihoods? Is it good for the manufacturing industry? Is it good for agriculture? Is it good for food standards? Is it good for the environment? And the answer to that, as we all know, to each of those questions is no. And I think Labour, you know, I totally agree with both what Laura and Seb are saying. You know, this is an opportunity for Labour. This is something that Tories, this is a bad policy, and we should be saying so. And I actually think that it can help split that Tory coalition, which was aligned against us in 2019. I think this is a real opportunity for us. Thank you.
Brilliant. I agree, unsurprisingly, I suspect, with all of that. So well done. And I agree, and I've thought the whole way along. I mean, since 2016, actually, this is a massive electoral opportunity for Labour, and Labour seems to have continued to decide that no, it isn't an opportunity at all, and we need to run away. And we're continuing to run away, which is a relatively brutal summary of Labour's position on this. But at the moment, we're not saying a great deal. It's not entirely true. I mean, I saw there was a video going around today. Pat McFadden was yesterday in Parliament, I think, holding the Conservatives to account on the impact of their Brexit deal, and others like Emily Thornberry, Rachel Reeves do the same. What that doesn't do, which is great, and I celebrate them, you know, when they do that. What that doesn't do is cut through to the general public, and what it doesn't do is put together, you know, the kind of narrative that our speakers have been talking about that will enable us to, you know, really challenge the Conservatives, well, in Buckley and Spen in about 10 days' time, or in the coming general election, which is now actually not very far away at all, we suspect, because people are now thinking it's going to be 2023. Anyway, we will take questions. So first off, I'm going to come to the brilliant Peter Hay, and I'm very delighted that Peter Hay has joined us, former MP, if people are unaware. Peter, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, then please go ahead.
Well, thanks, Mike. I'm not sure about the brilliant, but I thought those were 3 brilliant speeches, and it was great to hear them because they span a breadth of support in the party that's really important if you're going to turn this issue around. And if you just look at Northern Ireland, and I speak as a former Secretary of State, the protocol was the only solution, given, to use Laura's excellent analogy, that they decided to jump out of the window, former Brexit, rather than take the elevator down. And I think it's important we are really on the front foot in pointing that out. We've already, the form of Brexit they've chosen has already sold out the fishers and the farmers and it's about to sell out the workers big time, and it sold out their big allies, the unionists, or who they thought the unionists thought they were their allies, or they betrayed them. And we're going to get more of this. And actually, with the Australian deal, they chose a form of deal with the Australians that was again a kick in the teeth for making sure that the protocol worked more effectively in Northern Ireland. Because the key is that they've chosen not to align at all on standards with their form of Brexit. And that is why it is such a problem in Northern Ireland. It's why the fishing community is facing such a problem, and why the farming community is facing such a problem. And it's going to get worse. And if I just make one final point, and Laura, I think, quite rightly highlighted this, we've got to win back workers and the trade unions to a pro-European position. The reason that the trade union movement switched from largely anti-common market in the old nomenclature was when Jacques Delors came to a TUC Congress and actually showed that workers' rights would improve in the European Union. And I think future trade deals are going to see a diminution of workers' rights comparative to Europe. So that's another positive agenda for us to build upon, apart from the fishing community and the farming community, which has never been particularly pro us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. Who would like to respond to that? Seb, why don't you respond to that? Because I know you have to go in a minute.
Yeah, I'm really sorry that I have to leave very promptly, I'm afraid. But Peter, you're absolutely right. And you know, to pay tribute to the work that you did as Secretary of State in you know what was an incredibly fragile at the time peace agreement that you know has been cemented over many years and is now so part of life in not just in Northern Ireland but on the island of Ireland that you know its removal is utterly unthinkable. And I'm afraid you know we now have a government that has no sense of the sacrifice and hard work that went into the creation of the Good Friday Agreement and the settlement that it produced, who look at things in this kind of completely, you know, one nation above everything else, and that nation, by the way, is the United Kingdom, and there can be no differences in it. It's kind of one integrated. Now we know it's complicated. The UK is a complicated entity. You know, but we haven't even talked about, you know, Scotland and Wales, of course, where, you know, the bonds that are so important that we believe very strongly in. You know, we're not nationalists, but, you know, it's clear that they are being undermined. And Brexit is a huge part of this. And of course, Northern Ireland is layered and very complicated in many ways. And the protocol is kind of a crystallization of that, but you know it's happening across this union, and it's all because this government has absolutely no sense of seeing things through the eyes of others. And it's really important that we as the Labour Party don't lose sight of that, because of course the discussion that we have here in a UK context is very different to the discussion that's being had in each of the devolved nations. And of course it's a different discussion as well, again, when you break it down even further to regional and city levels. So yeah, I completely agree. And you know, their insistence on not having any kind of alignment when this really could solve the problem, and their insistence on now trying to undermine the protocol, I mean, they are doing their very best to bring about an end to the settlement that's been produced. And ultimately, I think they are feeding the nationalist agenda in Ireland and also in Scotland. Now, in Ireland, it's based on consent, and of course in Scotland it's based on consent. But they're going to do their very best to prevent both of those from happening. But yes, you're absolutely right, Peter. I'm really sorry that I have to go. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry. Thank you so much for joining.
Not
Great to see you as always, and we will see you very soon.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Bye for now. Laura, Christabel, did you want to respond to Peter?
Yeah, I had a question really back for Peter, because I completely agreed with what he said, and I also agreed with Seb's comments on Northern Ireland. It was about the trade unions. I mean, maybe this is also for others. I mean, clearly one of the things that didn't go well for us and is not still going very well for us is the trade union, you know, the trade union collective standing up for its workers. I mean, the ambivalence about about Brexit. I understood it from those who were very, thinking within a narrow Labour context, those who are very pro-Corbyn, and lots of us sort of swallowed the loyalty pill, and people didn't want to take a position against Brexit because it was seen as undermining Jeremy. So I kind of got where Len McCluskey came from, though I disagreed with him. But it went way beyond. It went way beyond the trade unions who were sort of loyal to Corbyn. We ended up with this vow of silence, really. And how do we now get ourselves in a better place with the trade union movement? Because really, the impact is being felt through by rank and file members, and yet still I don't feel that we hear enough. It's interesting what you said about Jacques Delors came and did his sort of great big historic rousing piece, but how out there in workplaces can we engage with the trade union movement so that the story of what is happening can be told also from that perspective? Because this was another limitation, of course, of the Remain campaign. It felt like a lot of sort of think tankers and people talking about billions and trillions, and not necessarily what it would mean in workplace X. Now, we are the Labour Party and the party of the union, so there must be a way that we can do this, but we haven't figured it out in the last 5 years. We haven't effectively leveraged those contacts and connections and all of that knowledge about what is happening. So I don't know, Peter or others have an answer to that, but...
Peter, do you want to come back on that?
Well, Laura, I don't think it's easy, but I'm not sure to what extent unions now, the unions are around about 10% of the private sector in terms of our representation. So there's a larger question about who the unions represent, but we've got to have that discussion, and it should be about socialist values in that context and about workers' rights specifically, because that's the next big attack coming, which is why I linked it to the fishers and the farmers. And of course, the people in Northern Ireland, though half of Northern Ireland actually supports the protocol. Don't forget that. Nationalists and Republicans are enthusiasts for it. They want the rough edges smoothed out and a lighter touch, which is easily negotiable if Frost and Boris want to do it, by the way. But I think it's a question of reconstructing a platform where we as a Labour Party are seen to speak for a particularly deindustrialized working class areas again, in a way that we haven't for quite a while.
I think that's all fair, and I do agree. I think it was a problem in the Remain campaign, but it remained a problem in the People's Vote campaign and all the attendant campaigns as well, including ours. Actually, we never really reached out beyond the kind of usual suspects, and it certainly never became a popular movement. I mean, you didn't see, there were marches of 1 million people in London, and there definitely were, and they did feature people from all over the country, but there were not marches of hundreds or thousands in Barnsley, Grimsby, anywhere else in the country, and that's a problem actually. Christabel, you look like you want to say.
By the
something.
way, just a brief point: we did win. We won leave areas in Wales in the election in May. Just point that out, by the way.
We did. Welsh Labour's doing an incredible job, but that's probably another webinar, which I'll probably invite you to, Peter. Anyway, go ahead, Christabel.
All I was about to say is unusually, I was going to be slightly more optimistic than you, Mike, about the Remain campaign. I mean, okay, so the marches were in London rather than in Barnsley and wherever, but I mean, they were huge. And I remember at the time, the frustration with the media coverage was that you had all these journalists kind of breathlessly going around to Nigel Farage's Brexit Party rallies. And I think there were 20 of them. And he got a few thousand to teach. And like even on the most pessimistic calculation of the numbers who came to London on several occasions to march for Remain, it was something like a 10th or even a 20th of that number. And yet one of the things I would go back and really have a go at the media for their coverage during the Remain campaign, but also in the aftermath of it, was that they insisted on portraying Leavers. It was this kind of, it was the angry vox pop. They would find the angriest person in Grimsby and interview them on the news, and then sort of cut to some sort of latte drinking Remainer in Brighton. And there was always this kind of contrast between this kind of angry, authentic Leaver and a sort of laissez-faire middle class Remainer. And actually, I think that it was a very unfair depiction, when, of course, and I think it's an interesting thing about the polling. Actually, Remainers seem angrier at the moment. We're the ones that have the negative views of the other side, and yet that sort of, because I think that idea of the angry Leaver persists, is partly why I think the Labour Party is so frightened to take a position on this.
I agree. Thank you, Christabel. And Peter and Laura. Vicky Seddon, I know you have a question, so if you could unmute yourself and go ahead, then that would be great.
Hi, it's not really a question, it's a contribution.
That's fine.
And I hope that's okay. I will try to be very brief.
Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much, everybody, for the really interesting comments you've had to make, and the detail and what have you. And thanks for reminding me that I was actually at the TUC when Jack Delors came. I was actually there listening to him. So, and I'd forgotten all about that. So thank you for reminding me. I want to make, you've made lots of detailed comments about where we are and what we do now, etc. But I want to make 3 general comments, which I think for me need to underpin our strategic perspective. First, I think long term, in terms of our the UK's relationship with the EU, long term, not talking about 5 years, we're talking about when we were members. We did not get it. We did not get in there and played a leadership role within the EU. We stood on the sidelines and we sniped and criticised, instead of saying that we were going to be in there, we were going to be a part of Europe, we were going to play a leadership role and make that very positive in terms of how we as the UK can contribute to the European Union. And I think long term we need to think about the perspective, the implications of that, and how we might do things differently in another time. Secondly, the issue about that whole thing about take back control was a very powerful message, because people don't feel they are in control of the politics of our country. And what happened, of course, was it's a real issue, but the EU was blamed, and that was not the right place to blame, because we have long term not got to grips properly with the democratic structures of our own country, so that people could feel they were in control, whether it's to do with how we vote for our MPs, whether it's to do with local government, and how we've had our powers undermined consistently, both by Labour and by the Conservatives. So that whole thing about it was waiting for the Conservatives or the Leavers to kind of take it and use it against the EU, and the EU became the scapegoat, and that is what happened in the referendum. And the third point I want to make is, what do we do now? I'm really keen that we don't take forward this issue about you're a Remainer or a Leaver, and how do we deal with all of that? My perspective is this, that we should say we have left the European Union. What relationship do we now want with the EU? Because I think that thing about Labour having a positive, instead of being a negative, into not just criticising the Conservatives, but finding a way of organising a national debate about what that relationship should be, where Leavers and Remainers can contribute without having those labels on them, will be a much more unifying and a much more positive way of Labour taking the debate forward. Thank you for listening to me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vicky. Always good to hear from you. There's a couple of things people have put in the chat I'm going to read out in a minute. Layla's got a comment. If everybody else wants to comment, then now's your time. I'll do that, and then I'll come back to Laura and Christabel for final comments, and they can respond to Vicky, and then we'll finish up. So Layla, why don't you go ahead? And if anybody else wants to contribute, please raise your hand using the reactions tab. Go ahead, Layla.
Thanks, Mike. I think another thing is, for me, is, you know, the Tory party always portrayed as the party for businesses, and a lot of businesses are really struggling at the moment, and I think it's going to get worse more and more. And I think we really need to take Labour into the position of being a lot more vocal about how Brexit is hurting not big corporations, but it's definitely hurting all the small businesses, which you know, in Croydon, where I'm from, is the majority of the fabric of our business community. And we need to campaign a lot more about that, but not just say, oh, this is bad and this is bad. I think there is a vacuum at the moment of what we should be doing instead, or what could work. And I just wondered what the thoughts of speakers were on Sadiq Khan's proposal to try and campaign for a special visa for London and the hospitality sector, because at first I was like, oh, that's great. And then I thought, no, actually, I don't want that. I don't want that. I want to be more ambitious and really stop this narrative that immigration is bad. Immigration has always been positive economically and on so many other levels. And we should just be a bit bolder and not just say, oh, yeah, we just want a bit of immigration for London to help with the hospitality sector. Because it's just sending that message. We are a Labour Party, and we're sending the message that we want immigration for, you know, low-skilled jobs, low-paid jobs. And then we've gone the other extreme of that, the Conservative Party saying that they only want really highly skilled jobs. And we've got the Dildo Hardings of the world saying they don't want anyone, you know, they only want British people working in the NHS. I mean, there's so much we could capitalize on that and actually make a positive message about immigration and free movement. And we're just staying silent. And I get really frustrated, particularly as an immigrant, an expat, whatever you want to call me, living in the UK. I feel very frustrated. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Layla. And then Neil, I'll come to you. And then I've got a couple of things to throw in from the chat, and then we'll come back to Laura and Christabel. So Neil, go ahead.
I hope. Yeah, my problem with talk about our goal should be renegotiate the deal is, first of all, it implies that there's a form of Brexit that can work, which we all know is patently untrue. And the second thing is it sends a message to people, I think, that we're kicking rejoining into the long grass. And I've seen a lot of people chat on things on Facebook, a lot of people of a certain age, and they are in not a good place because they feel that they want to die, if you will, a member of the European Union, for want of a better term. They don't want to be out of the EU. And all this talk of closer ties and stuff is a hostage to who's in number 10 down the street anyway. You know, if we have a Tory, we have distant links. We have Labour, we have closer. I think so what we need to do personally, I think, is we need to start the process of rejoining now. The sooner we start, the less effort we're going to have to make when the time comes. And I'm convinced the time will come when the reality of Brexit kicks in. I mean, think about this. If somehow you could have held an election in January of this year, obviously it would have had to be done electronically or by mail, Boris Johnson wouldn't have got anywhere. Because all those people who were, if you forgive my language, pissed off about their ruined Christmas, they wouldn't have voted Tory the way they did 5 or 6 months later once the vaccine kicked in. It's the same with this. Once the reality of Brexit comes along, all those people who, as Christabel said, just by a thing would vote against rejoining, that's going to change, surely. There's going to come a point where the only barrier to rejoining the EU is the EU itself saying you can't, which is a real possibility. I think we've got to accept that, or not under terms you might like. And obviously having politicians saying we will push to rejoin, because I'm concerned that one day we're going to get a thing and there's going to be accused of jumping on a bandwagon or U-turning. It's like, couple of years ago, you were talking about closer ties. Now you're talking about rejoining. What's changed? Oh, could it be that there's 10 million unemployed or whatever it might be? So the sooner we start, the better, because look what happened with the referendum. At a certain point, when you ask the question of a Labour person, are we going to have a referendum? They would have said no, and no to having Remain on the ballot. Come the election, it's yes, we're going to have a referendum, and yes, Remain is going to be on the ballot. And we didn't explain that journey we took. Instead, we wasted 3 years that could have been spent explaining to people why, so that Christabel wouldn't need to do that on that thing. That Jen would have known why a referendum was a good idea, because it's no different to when you delete an email, the message comes up, are you sure you want to delete this email? So that's what I'm worried about. Whenever we talk about this, we are under aiming. It's one thing to settle for closer ties because the EU won't let us back in. It's another thing to aspire to it. And I just feel that that's what we're doing. We're aspiring to second best. And maybe another thing we need to do as a sidebar to this is play the patriotism card. It is our patriotic duty to do what's best for Britain. And what's best for Britain is to be a member of the European Union. Let's take their colours and wrap us. Right? It's like the flag, isn't it? The BNP and these right wingers have the flag. Those of us who are decent people who are not racist and not all these things, we can't. I can't go around the t-shirt with a Union Jack on because people, well, hey, look at my hair, people will think ill of me. So I think that's the kind of approach we've got to look at. We aren't being excited enough. We're not being dramatic enough. We're not taking the bold steps. What was it like Kennedy used to say about when he was talking about the moon landing? He used the analogy of the kid who threw the shoes over the wall and they had to go get it. We need to throw the shoes of rejoining over the wall. So that's basically what I'm saying. I think we should need to be more aggressive about this. Obviously, we must be respectful to people who voted leave, but we have to find a way to bring them along. We have to persuade them why rejoining is in their interest and that it's not unpatriotic to pursue that.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Great to hear from you, and also Vicky's comments as well, and Layla's as well. So Christabel, Laura, I'll come to you in a second. A couple of things in the chat I want to throw in. So Peter posted to me a question and said the key for him is to reach and energise local members, I guess the Labour Party members and non-members, especially the young. I guess kind of saying, you know, we need more people involved. We need to spread this out beyond the usual suspects, as in those of us that are not going to give up until we've rejoined, basically, and make this a big movement. Do you agree? And if so, kind of what would you do about that? And then a question from Owain, which I think I'm just going to answer. He says, Mike, could pushing for the extension of the Northern Ireland Protocol to Scotland be Labour's key point of differentiation? My very simple and possibly slightly blunt answer to that is no, because the Northern Ireland Protocol exists to prevent a land border on the island of Ireland. Extending it to Scotland would create a land border between England and Scotland. Admittedly, the problems created by that would be trade rather than peace, conflict. But nevertheless, nobody wants to show their passport when they're getting the train to Edinburgh. So I think that's a very unlikely conclusion, even though Scotland, I'm sure, would be delighted. So without further ado, Christabel, I'll come to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. So just in response to what a couple of the speakers said, just on immigration is quite interesting. I mean, immigration was obviously a really huge topic during the referendum, and ultimately, I think we can't argue against the fact that that hostility to immigration was a huge driver, possibly the biggest driver behind the Leave vote. What's really interesting.
That was me. Sorry, I muted.
Oh right, okay. So you don't want to hear about immigrants then? Fine, Mike.
No, I muted the wrong person.
So what's really interesting is that actually hostility to immigration in the UK has been falling since 2015, so since before the referendum. And so both, you see, people are becoming more appreciative of the contribution that migrants make to the UK, and at the same time they think that it's a less important issue. And I mean, you know, it's one of the sort of really despairing things is that it's one of those trends that if the referendum had simply been held even 18 months later, very possibly with demographic changes, actually, I think Remain could have squeaked to victory. So I do think that the environment to make the case for freedom of movement is a better one than we had even a few years ago. So it is controversial. It will rile a lot of people, but I think that ultimately there is a case to be made. I think there are, majority of people have said that they would accept freedom of movement in return for membership of the single market. So I think there is a case to be made for that. On rejoin, I strongly sense that there is no appetite for that amongst most of the British public at the moment. But I do think that we need to start building that case kind of from the bottom up. We start off by sort of saying we need a closer relationship, we need to follow the rules, because otherwise people are just going to lose their jobs and things are going to be bad. We need to follow the rules in order to protect our economy, and because actually these are quite good rules anyway. And then you sort of move on from that. Well, okay, if we're going to follow these rules, why would we not want to have a say in those rules? But I think we need to take that journey step by step and take people with us on each step of the journey. I think that's largely what we failed to do when we were members of the EU, is to explain why we do all of these things at each step and then get consent to move on to the next one. But I'm very hopeful that, if we did move to a closer relationship, just the logic of it says we should then be EU members eventually. So that's my hope.
Brilliant. Thank you. Laura.
Yes, I agree with that. I'm now going to make myself smile because I've actually got a statistic, which in front of Christabel Cooper, I must be feeling brave. But on the immigration point, the really good UK in a Changing Europe session today had Rob Ford, who's a professor of politics at Manchester University, and he was talking about the salience of different issues. Basically how important they were in ranked order to the great British public at the time of the referendum, and immigration was a sort of 50% of people. It was the thing, and that's now a sort of sub 10, as he described it, issue. It's gone way down. Of course, what the Tories have done very cleverly is they've built up a broader, the so-called culture wars agenda. So if they can't trip us up on immigration alone, they're going to try to trip us up on all sort of other liberal metropolitan elite things, which they conflate with Remainerism. And that was a really interesting number that I got from this presentation. In 2017, there were 16 articles in the UK press on the so-called culture wars. This is the mainstream printed media. And in 2020, there were 534. So the Tories are doing a staggeringly effective job at building up and keeping going the culture wars, which they then, of course, link into Brexit. And we have to find a way as a party we need a better comms operation, which hopefully we're now going to get. But we have to find a way as a party of cutting through that. I agree completely with Vicky's point about needing to move on from Remainers and Leavers. And for about the last sort of year and a half or two, I've tried to discipline myself into talking about people who voted Leave rather than Leavers, because we all have multiple political identities just as human beings. I'm very into PR. And one of the things that I have to just get my head around is lots of other people who are also very into PR, electoral reform, are more into other things. And we've just got to accept that Brexit isn't the be all and end all for many, and it's unreasonable and inaccurate to describe it in that way. But we also damage our own political opportunities when we do that, because by describing people primarily as leavers, we forget the fact that they care about the NHS, they care about education and services, they want investment in infrastructure in their local areas, the stuff, of course, the Tories are now going to also pretend to do. So I completely agree with you, Vicky. I think it's both inaccurate but also electorally unhelpful. On Sadiq and the special visa, I'm sorry that Layla's gone, but I also agree with what she said. I think we need to be more ambitious, but we also need to not allow ourselves to be trapped into this good, bad, or useful, less useful migrant discourse. I moved to Bulgaria in 2010, slightly randomly, and stayed for sort of professional reasons. But the single most important thing that happened to me in Bulgaria was that I met my Italian husband, and we then had the right to come and live in one of our countries. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. You know, neither of us was an investment banker, nor were we picking fruit or doing some of the other so-called low-skilled jobs, although I challenge anyone to spend an entire day, never mind months on end, picking fruit, because it's bloody knackering. But we weren't in either of those categories of useful workers. Does that somehow deny our basic rights? So I think I agree with Leila. On the one hand, we need to be more ambitious with a more strategic push for pro-immigration policies, but we also need to not lose behind people's fundamental rights, which the good, bad, useful, less useful migrant narrative obviously does. On Neil's point, I have an enormous amount of sympathy for your obvious frustration that this is going to take a while, and that in itself is bad, and we need to get going now. And I mean, I, like all of us, I guess, I massively regret that we leave. I'm still fed up about it. But I don't think describing ourselves as a rejoin campaign now is politically helpful. I think it makes us look tin-eared given the general election result that we had not that long ago. That's not to say that lots of the ingredients of a good rejoin campaign aren't things that we need to start doing, from the very strategic level relationship building, politician to politician in the EU, through to the grassroots movement building, which we did not do as well as the Leave campaign. We did it much better after the referendum than we did before. So lots of the things that we would need to do in order to get ourselves into the position when we could eventually rejoin, we need to do, but I wouldn't call it rejoin. And I do think one of those first staging posts is anyway the review of the deal in 2024. And one of the more important things we could do at a sort of strategic central political level is preparing our MPs, who are a lot less EU illiterate than they were in 2016 anyway, so that they are well armed at one end. And at the other end, I think we need to have some serious discussions in the pro-EU world between all of the various different groups. We need to find a way of collaborating more effectively than we have in the past. And we need to find a way of channeling some resources so that we can build up grassroots movements way beyond Westminster. I mean, it's great that we've got Best for Britain doing polling, you know, and it's great that we've got, you know, LEF briefing MPs, and it's great that we've got Another Europe is Possible sort of talking to the more radical end of the pro-EU world, and you know, the great and the good in London meetings. But we need an out there, bottom up movement, which also must involve trade unionists. So we need to find a way of getting ourselves more coordinated and pushing some resources out. So I wouldn't call it rejoin, but if we do those things, it puts us in a better place to rejoin. So we might have to agree to disagree, I think, Neil, on this one. But in terms of your very obvious frustration, I'm 150% with you.
Great. Good. Right. We are a little bit over time, so we're going to have to finish up there. But I mean, just last comment from me really is about this thing about the narrative. And at the moment, I feel that there's only one political narrative in play, which is the Conservatives' narrative. And it doesn't really feel like there is a Labour narrative. And I think that part of the reason for that is that we don't know what to say about Brexit. So many of the problems in our society, in our economy, and our sense of self as a nation result from Brexit. And because we're on the back foot and we don't know what to say about that, and we just don't have the confidence to come out and criticise it as a project, it means that we then feel stymied, or we just don't really have a starting point for concocting arguments to criticise them on anything else. Although there are, of course, other things that we could do. I mean, we could go back and criticise their record further back and criticise austerity and a whole host of other things, and indeed criticise their performance during the pandemic, which has been horrific and pretty much worst in the world in terms of public health and also in terms of the economy. So there are things I don't understand in terms of why Labour is being, in my view, so cautious in its criticisms of the government. But what that does, particularly with the Brexit piece, which is completely central to their whole narrative of what was wrong with Britain and how they're going to make it right, that does mean that it's difficult for us to tell a different story to the public. And if we can't do that by the next election, we're going to lose, because voters do to an extent vote on policies, but they much more vote on the story of this is who we are, this is where we're going. And at the moment, it doesn't feel like we've got one. So I'm sure we will by the next election, but certainly what we can do as Labour members and Labour activists and people passionate about our country is help Labour put that together through the conversations that we have and the tweets that we write and the conversations with our MPs and in our CLPs and so on. So we will leave that there. So yeah, 5 years on, we've come a long way. I think I'm probably most encouraged by Christabel's contribution tonight, because it just feels like what she's been telling us about different changes in public opinion, particularly on the Leave side and the the fact that a lot of the kind of anger and emotion and angst maybe has gone out of things for that cohort of the population is positive, because it then hopefully means that we can then have a conversation without it appearing like it's us versus them and our team versus their team, which was never a helpful starting point. So thank you so much for coming. Great to see you all. We will be back fairly soon with more of these, and we've got the podcast of course as well, so there's different ways to engage with us. Presumably you're all on our mailing list, which is how you found out about tonight. If you haven't yet joined as a member, then please do, because that helps us continue doing the things that we do. And thanks again for joining, and we'll see you all soon. And finally, thank you again to Laura and Christabel. Great to see you both as always. Have a good rest of the evening.
Thanks for having us. Ciao.
Ciao.
Thanks everybody. Thanks everybody.
Bye.
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 Thanks. Bye bye.
Buonasera.
Ciao.